The Sandakan Death Marches. January 1945 to March 1945. In 1942 and 1943, Australian and British POs who had been captured at the Battle of Singapore were shipped to North Borneo to construct a military airstrip and prisoner of war camps at Sandakan, North Borneo. As on the Burma Railway, the prisoners were forced to work at gunpoint and were often beaten whilst also receiving very little food or medical attention. In August 1943, with the intention of controlling the enlisted men by removing any commanders, most officer-ranked prisoners were moved from Sandakan to the Batu Lintang camp at Kuching. Conditions for the remaining prisoners deteriorated sharply following the officers' removal. Rations were further reduced, and sick prisoners were also forced to work on the airstrip. After construction had been completed, the prisoners initially remained at the camp. In January 1945, with approximately 1,900 prisoners still alive, the advancing Allies managed to successfully bomb and destroy the airfield. It was at this time, with Allied landings anticipated shortly, that Camp Commandant Captain Hoshijima Susumi decided to move the remaining prisoners westward into the mountains to the town of Ranau, a distance of approximately 260 kilometers. The first marches. The first phase of marches across wide marshland, dense jungle, and then up the eastern slope of Mount Kinabalu occurred between January and March 1945. The Japanese had selected 470 prisoners who were thought to be fit enough to carry baggage and supplies for the accompanying Japanese battalions relocating to the western coast. In several groups, the POs, all of whom were either malnourished or suffering serious illness, started the journey originally under the intention of reaching Jesselton Kota Kinabalu. Although the route took 9 days, they were given enough rations for only 4 days. Upon reaching Ranau, survivors were halted and ordered to construct a temporary camp, and the prisoners' food ration was cut to only 4 ounces. Of the 470 Australian and British prisoners of war, only 190 of the Australian prisoners had survived the first death march. The second marches. The Japanese undertook a second death march on the 29th of May 1945 with 536 more prisoners who could still stand on their feet. The Sandakan camp commander, Captain Tokokura, assembled these prisoners outside the gate, and then they set off towards Ranau in groups of about 50 with Japanese guards at the front, rear and sides of each group. The Japanese guards had been ordered to kill instantly any prisoner who collapsed from exhaustion or tried to escape. The main camp was set on fire behind them to destroy any evidence of its existence. The second Sandakan death march lasted for 26 days. Only 183 prisoners reached Ranau. The remaining 353 prisoners had either died on the march from a combination of starvation, sickness and exhaustion, or were killed by the Japanese guards because they were too weak to continue the trek. On their arrival at Ranau on the 24th of June 1945, the participants in the second death march found that only 6 prisoners from the 470 who had left Sandakan in January were still alive. Although weak and exhausted, the survivors of the second death march were then put to hard labor, and the death toll soared. The final march. So far, 2 death marches have happened. The final march took place on the 9th of June 1945. Approximately 250 prisoners were left at Sandakan after the second march. Most prisoners were so ill that the Japanese initially intended to let them starve to death, forcing many to scavenge in the surrounding forest for food. However, on the 9th of June 1945 it was decided to send another group of 75 men on a final march. All remaining prisoners left at Sandakan who could not walk either were killed or died from a combination of starvation and sickness before the Japanese surrender on the 15th of August 1945. The remaining men were so weak that none survived beyond 50 kilometers. As each man collapsed from exhaustion, he was shot by a Japanese guard. When it became certain that Japan would have to surrender, extraordinary efforts were made to protect those responsible for Japan's atrocities. On the 20th of August 1945, the senior Japanese officer in charge of prisoner of war and civilian internment camps ordered camp guards to destroy all evidence of atrocities or brutal treatment of prisoners of war and civilians, and advised guilty camp guards to transfer or flee. In total, only 6 Australian servicemen managed to escape. During the second marches, gunner Owen Campbell and bombardier Richard Braithwaite managed to escape into the jungle, where they were assisted by locals and eventually rescued by Allied units. During July, Private Nelson Short, Warrant Officer William Stikpovich, Private Keith Botterill, and Lance Bombardier William Moxham managed to escape from Ranau, and were also helped by the local people, who fed them and hid them from the Japanese until the end of the war. Time for a quick side story about Private Keith Botterill's friend Private Richard Murray. In May 1945, Private Richard Murray was one of only 30 depots still alive at Ranau. He and Private Keith Botterill stole rice from the Japanese to build up food stocks as they intended to escape. When the theft was discovered, Private Murray stepped forward to take responsibility, knowing he would be killed. Of the 6 survivors, only 4 survived the lingering effects of their ordeal to give evidence at various war crimes trials. The 4 who survived were Stikpovich, Botterill, Short, and Campbell. Captain Hoshijima was found guilty of war crimes and hanged on the 6th of April 1946.